Ladies and gentlemen, Jim Bridger's journey into the wilderness began at an age when most young men were still discovering themselves. At just 17 years old, he left behind the familiar surroundings of civilization and joined the Ashley Henry expedition in 1822, a bold and dangerous fur trading venture that sought to explore and capitalize on the largely uncharted territory of the American West. This was not a journey of comfort or security. It was a gamble into lands teeming with both opportunity and deadly risks. The expedition set out from St. Louis, Missouri, traveling up the Missouri River into the heart of the unknown, where grizzly bears, rugged mountains, and tense relations with native tribes were everyday concerns. Bridger was the youngest among the group, but he quickly proved that age was no barrier to survival. What he lacked in years, he made up for in endurance, sharp observation, and a willingness to learn. Under the guidance of seasoned trappers and frontiersmen, he picked up the essential skills of wilderness life: how to trap beaver, how to skin animals for pelts, how to build a fire in freezing rain, and how to read the landscape like a living map. These weren't just technical skills, they were the difference between life and death. Unlike many of his companions who saw the frontier as a place to make quick money and then return to the East, Bridger seemed drawn to the rawness of the wild itself. He didn't flinch at danger. Instead, he absorbed every lesson nature had to offer, from the patterns of animal migration to the unpredictable moods of mountain weather. The grueling pace of the fur trade, which involved weeks or months of travel with heavy loads, braving snowstorms and steep terrain, didn't wear him down. It shaped him, and as the fur trade evolved, so did Bridger. What started as an economic expedition for beaver pelts soon became the beginning of a lifelong bond between him and the American wilderness. The experiences of these early years, the camaraderie, the suffering, the stunning landscapes, and the constant threat of the unknown, laid the foundation for what would become one of the most legendary wilderness lives in American history. What set Jim Bridger apart from so many other men who ventured into the wilderness wasn't just his courage. It was how quickly and instinctively he adapted to the brutal and unpredictable demands of frontier life. Within a short time of entering the fur trade, Bridger displayed an uncanny ability to absorb knowledge, master practical skills, and make decisions that meant the difference between survival and death. While many men perished or turned back after facing the relentless hardships of the wild, Bridger not only endured, he thrived. The American West was a landscape of extremes: blistering heat in the deserts, bone-cracking cold in the mountains, sudden floods, wild animals, and constant threats from rival fur trappers or hostile encounters. Yet, Bridger moved through this chaotic world with an ease that amazed his companions. He learned how to locate hidden water sources in arid regions, how to construct makeshift shelters with whatever nature provided, and how to build fires even when the wood was wet and the wind was howling. He became an expert in tracking both animals and people, often reading signs in the dirt or broken branches that others completely missed. His senses became finely tuned to the wilderness. He could smell weather changes, identify bird calls as warnings, and sense danger long before it arrived. Bridger's ability to navigate vast mountain ranges, often without a compass or map, was considered almost supernatural by those who followed him. He developed a memory for landscapes and routes that would rival any cartographer's knowledge, which made him invaluable not only to fur companies, but eventually to explorers, soldiers, and settlers alike. Equally important was his openness to learning from the Native American tribes who knew the land better than anyone. Bridger didn't approach these cultures with arrogance. Instead, he observed, listened, and adopted their ways when necessary. He learned how to make snowshoes, how to dry and preserve meat, and how to use herbal remedies to treat illness and injury. This cultural adaptability, combined with his growing wilderness expertise, allowed him to bridge two worlds, earning respect among native tribes while still proving indispensable to white traders and pioneers. While many viewed nature as something to conquer, Jim Bridger treated it as a teacher. He paid attention, he respected its rules, and in return, nature revealed its secrets to him. This harmony with the environment became the bedrock of his long survival, allowing him to travel farther, last longer, and face greater risks than most men would dare. Jim Bridger's transformation from a young trapper to one of the greatest pathfinders in American history didn't happen overnight, but it happened with such precision and natural instinct that those around him soon realized he possessed a rare gift. In a land without roads, signs, or maps, where getting lost could mean certain death, Bridger developed an extraordinary ability to read the land. He could trace animal paths through dense forests, spot hidden passes in the towering Rocky Mountains, and sense the safest route through hostile terrain with remarkable consistency. As the years passed, Bridger's reputation as a tracker grew far beyond the fur trade. He could follow the faintest tracks across rocky ground, marks most men would never even notice. He paid attention to the smallest clues, a bent blade of grass, disturbed pebbles, a faint scent carried by the wind. His tracking skills were so refined that he could tell how old a trail was, how many people or animals had passed through, and even estimate how fast they had been traveling. These skills were not just for hunting or trapping. They were essential tools for staying alive and helping others survive too. But Bridger wasn't just a follower of trails. He was a maker of them. As he roamed the untamed wilderness of the West, he discovered new routes over mountains, through valleys, and along river systems that would one day become lifelines for westward expansion. His discovery of paths like Bridger Pass and his knowledge of routes through the Rockies would later serve as critical guideposts for wagon trains, gold seekers, and immigrants heading to Oregon, California, and Utah. These weren't easy trails. Many crossed dangerous terrain, freezing peaks, and barren plains, but Bridger's knowledge allowed thousands to pass through where none had before. His memory of the land was photographic, even encyclopedic. He could recall specific turns in a river, the location of hidden springs, and the safest crossing points long after his first journey through an area. When soldiers, settlers, and explorers needed guidance, it was often Jim Bridger they turned to, not just because he knew where to go, but because they trusted him to get them there alive. And Bridger's pathfinding wasn't limited to the physical terrain. He often had to calculate how to move through politically dangerous territory, lands claimed or patrolled by various native tribes, each with their own customs and boundaries. Bridger knew where diplomacy was needed, when to avoid an area entirely, and how to take an alternate route that could save time, lives, and resources. His intuition, developed over decades of raw experience, became legendary. In a time when many frontiersmen saw Native American tribes as obstacles or enemies, Jim Bridger took a different approach, one built on observation, understanding, and mutual respect. From the earliest days of his time in the wilderness, Bridger realized that true survival in the American West required more than knowing the land. It meant understanding the people who had lived there for generations. Rather than confront or dismiss the native cultures he encountered, Bridger immersed himself in them, earning the trust of tribes that few white men were ever able to approach peacefully. Bridger didn't just learn a few words or phrases for trading. He became fluent in multiple Native American languages, including Crow and Shoshone. He paid close attention to their customs, beliefs, and ways of life, not out of curiosity alone, but because he knew it was essential for survival and cooperation. He formed deep relationships with various tribes, even marrying into native communities, which further solidified his place as a man who walked between two worlds. This cultural bridge building allowed Bridger to serve as a valuable mediator in times of tension. He was often called upon to help negotiate safe passage for fur trappers, settlers, and later, the U.S. military. His presence in tense meetings between tribal leaders and government representatives often calmed hostilities because many native leaders saw him as fair, wise, and respectful. He didn't carry the arrogance or aggression that so many others brought into native lands. He carried knowledge, humility, and a deep appreciation for their way of life. Bridger's insight into native traditions went beyond language and diplomacy. He adopted many of their survival techniques, from how to build effective winter shelters to how to identify medicinal plants. His ability to move freely among tribes, to understand their warnings and read their signals, gave him a unique advantage in the wilderness. He wasn't just coexisting. He was thriving within a cultural exchange that shaped his identity as much as the land itself. Even rival tribes who might have otherwise treated outsiders with hostility often spared Bridger because of his long-standing reputation for honesty and respect. Stories circulated of how he could walk into a village alone, unarmed, and be welcomed as a guest rather than challenged as a threat. In a region where misunderstandings could quickly lead to violence, Bridger's ability to foster trust was a rare and powerful skill. By the early 1840s, after nearly 2 decades of trapping, exploring, and guiding, Jim Bridger recognized a shift in the American frontier. The once lucrative fur trade was in decline, and the West was no longer just the domain of mountain men and trappers. It was becoming the highway of dreams for thousands of immigrants headed to the Pacific coast. In response to this new era of westward expansion, Bridger took one of the most significant steps of his life. He established Fort Bridger in 1843. Situated in what is now southwestern Wyoming, Fort Bridger was strategically placed along the Oregon Trail, one of the primary migration routes to the west. Its location was no accident. Bridger, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the terrain and the needs of travelers, knew this site offered water, pasture land for livestock, timber for repairs, and a defensible position in case of trouble. For pioneers weary from hundreds of miles of harsh travel, it was a sanctuary, part trading post, part repair station, and part social hub. But Fort Bridger wasn't just a physical structure. It was a symbol of the changing frontier. While other forts were strictly military or corporate outposts, Bridger's fort was built to serve a broader purpose. He envisioned it as a place where trappers, Native Americans, settlers, and even the occasional government official could interact. It was open to all, a rare neutral ground in a land full of conflict and uncertainty. Bridger and his partner, Luis Vasquez, stocked the fort with supplies desperately needed by migrants: tools, wagon parts, food, and ammunition. These goods were often traded for furs, horses, or labor, and the fort quickly became a vital lifeline for thousands making the perilous journey westward. What made Fort Bridger truly remarkable, however, was the man behind it. Unlike many frontier establishments, which were driven purely by profit or military strategy, Bridger infused his fort with the knowledge and experience he had gained over decades in the wild. He offered not just goods, but guidance, telling travelers which passes to take, warning them of tribal tensions, or directing them to safer river crossings. His presence at the fort added an air of trustworthiness and expertise that few others could offer. Of course, Fort Bridger also became a center of controversy and conflict. As tensions rose between different groups vying for control of the West, especially between the U.S. government, Mormon settlers, and native tribes, the fort was sometimes caught in the middle. Yet, throughout these turbulent years, Bridger maintained his post, adapting once again to the changing dynamics of frontier life. Few men in American history have endured the unrelenting fury of nature quite like Jim Bridger. Over the course of 5 decades in the wilderness, he faced, and survived, conditions that would have broken most others. From freezing blizzards in the Rocky Mountains to scorching heat in the deserts of Utah and Nevada, Bridger's life was a never-ending test of physical endurance, mental resilience, and unmatched survival instinct. Where others froze, starved, or were swept away by the violence of untamed rivers, Bridger endured, often with little more than the clothes on his back, a rifle, and his knowledge of the land. Winters in the high country were particularly brutal. Temperatures would plunge far below zero, snowdrifts could swallow a man whole, and food was often scarce. Bridger learned how to read the clouds for signs of approaching storms and how to dig snow caves for shelter. He knew that a fire built under the wrong kind of rock could lead to a deadly collapse, and that the slightest mistake, like getting wet, could lead to hypothermia and death. He learned to keep moving, to ration his strength, and to recognize the sounds of avalanches and cracking ice. Even during times when he was cut off from other humans for weeks or even months, he remained composed, relying on his finely honed instincts and his deep relationship with the natural world. Then there were the relentless summers, especially in the plains and desert basins, where heat shimmered off the earth and water became more precious than gold. Bridger knew how to locate hidden springs, dig shallow wells, and extract moisture from plants. He understood that traveling during the heat of the day was a recipe for disaster, and so he moved at dawn or dusk, using stars and distant peaks to guide his path. He had seen men die from sunstroke, dehydration, and snakebite, but he always stayed one step ahead, using every trick he'd learned from the land and the native tribes who had long mastered these survival techniques. Wild animals were another constant threat. Grizzly bears, wolves, mountain lions. Bridger had encounters with them all. He was said to have once survived a savage bear attack that nearly cost him his life, crawling back to safety with wounds that would have killed a lesser man. But he didn't just survive. He healed, adapted, and kept going, adding the experience to his growing reservoir of wilderness wisdom. Beyond the physical hardships, there were emotional and psychological challenges too. Long stretches of isolation, the loss of close companions to accidents or attacks, and the constant uncertainty of whether he'd live to see another sunrise. But Bridger's mindset was forged in adversity. He didn't see the wilderness as a punishment or a trial. He saw it as a teacher, a force to be understood rather than fought. Every storm he weathered, every canyon he escaped, and every animal he tracked sharpened him further. Jim Bridger's life was not just a personal journey of survival. It was a front-row seat to one of the most dramatic transformations in American history. Over the course of his 50 years in the wilderness, Bridger witnessed the untamed frontier evolve from a vast, uncharted expanse inhabited by native tribes and a handful of trappers into a land carved by wagon wheels, dotted with settlements, and claimed by a fast-growing nation. He saw the old world of fur trading and exploration give way to the new era of colonization, industry, and expansionism. When Bridger first entered the mountains as a young trapper in the 1820s, the West was a mystery to most Americans. It was a place whispered about in saloons and newspapers, full of danger, fortune, and myth. In those early years, he shared the wild with nomadic native tribes, buffalo herds that stretched for miles, and landscapes so untouched they seemed eternal. The fur trade dominated the frontier economy, and men like Bridger roamed thousands of miles through unknown territories in search of beaver pelts and adventure. He was part of that golden age of mountain men, rough, independent, and fearless. But change came quickly. The collapse of the fur trade in the late 1830s signaled the end of one era and the beginning of another. Bridger watched as wave after wave of settlers rolled westward, carving trails through lands once sacred and secluded. What had once been paths for trappers became the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, and the Mormon Trail. Thousands of wagons crossed the plains and mountains, often following routes that Bridger himself had scouted decades before. These newcomers brought with them not just dreams, but fences, towns, and governments. Bridger also witnessed the deepening conflict between Native American tribes and the encroaching settlers. Where once he had roamed freely with tribal allies and trading partners, he now saw hostilities erupt, treaties broken, and entire ways of life threatened by the surge of American expansion. His role gradually shifted from trapper to guide, then from guide to mediator, as he tried to navigate the growing divide between two worlds he understood intimately. He had close ties to Native communities, yet he also worked with the U.S. military and government expeditions, giving him a unique but often painful vantage point. He guided explorers and generals, showed them mountain passes and safe river crossings, and told stories of a West they were only beginning to know. Men like John C. Fremont, Kit Carson, and Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston all benefited from Bridger's knowledge, but many of them also represented the forces that would ultimately reshape the land he had known for most of his life. Railroads began to slice through the mountains, telegraph lines connected distant outposts, and native tribes were increasingly pushed onto reservations. Through all this, Jim Bridger stood as a living bridge between two eras, the old wilderness and the new frontier. He had walked with warriors, traded with chiefs, and hunted in the deep valleys of an untouched continent. Later, he stood alongside engineers, soldiers, and surveyors, watching as those same valleys filled with rail tracks and smoke from steamboats. He didn't just witness history. He was part of it, a figure whose own story mirrored the evolution of the American West. As the American frontier began to open up to waves of settlers, surveyors, and soldiers, few individuals were as sought after as Jim Bridger. With decades of hard-earned knowledge and a reputation built on accuracy, survival, and diplomacy, Bridger became an indispensable guide for those venturing into the unknown. Whether it was military expeditions mapping new territories, wagon trains seeking the safest route west, or scientists and politicians eager to chart the resources of the land, Bridger's name was always at the top of the list. What set Bridger apart was not just his familiarity with the terrain, but his unparalleled ability to recall landmarks, weather patterns, and tribal territories from memory. He could describe a mountain pass he had crossed 20 years earlier with stunning clarity, reciting the best water sources, the steepest inclines, and even how the sun would fall across the rocks at a certain time of year. For military leaders, this kind of precision was invaluable. On several major expeditions, including those led by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston and General William S. Harney, Bridger served as a lead scout, responsible not just for navigating the physical landscape, but for advising on strategic movement, avoiding hostile territory, and identifying potential ambush points. But guiding wasn't simply a job for Bridger, it was a responsibility. He understood the lives that hung in the balance on each journey. A poorly chosen river crossing, a delayed snowstorm in the mountains, or an unexpected tribal encampment could spell disaster. Bridger took every assignment seriously, often going ahead of the group to personally inspect routes, monitor weather signs, and interact with native tribes to ensure safe passage. His knowledge often meant the difference between a successful expedition and one lost to the wilderness. One of his most notable roles came during the mid-1850s, when rising tensions between the U.S. government and the Mormon settlers in Utah threatened to erupt into open conflict. Bridger, familiar with the rugged trails of the Wasatch Mountains and the high desert terrain of Utah, was called upon to guide federal troops into the region. He had already spent years observing the political and cultural dynamics of the area, and his guidance during what became known as the Utah War was crucial. Though he sympathized with the plight of many settlers and respected their determination, he remained a professional. His duty was to lead, to protect, and to advise. Bridger also worked closely with survey teams tasked with identifying potential routes for the Transcontinental Railroad. While others relied on maps and instruments, Bridger relied on instinct, memory, and experience. He could look at a range of mountains and know exactly where a pass might lie. He could glance at a valley and predict whether a flash flood might strike. For those who didn't understand the land, it all seemed like wizardry. But for Bridger, it was simply the product of a lifetime immersed in the rhythms of nature. His presence inspired confidence. Soldiers, explorers, and politicians alike felt safer knowing that Bridger was ahead of them, watching the trails, reading the signs, and planning the next move. Many wrote about him in journals and reports, describing him as humble, unshakable, and uncannily perceptive. He wasn't just a guide. He was a living map of the American West, a human compass forged by fire, frost, and time. One of the most defining and complex aspects of Jim Bridger's life was his deep, enduring relationship with Native American tribes. Unlike many frontiersmen of his era who viewed indigenous peoples as either enemies or obstacles, Bridger understood and respected their cultures, their knowledge, and their claim to the land. His survival and success in the wilderness were, in large part, because of the relationships he formed and maintained with various tribes throughout his life. These alliances were not just strategic. They were often personal, built on mutual respect, shared experience, and years of interaction. Bridger lived among native tribes for extended periods, learning their languages, customs, and ways of survival. He was fluent in several indigenous languages, including Crow and Shoshone, and could communicate effectively across tribal lines. This ability made him an invaluable intermediary during negotiations, peace talks, and trading sessions. He didn't approach tribal cultures as a distant outsider, but rather as someone who had immersed himself in their worldview. He knew their sacred places, their migration patterns, their taboos, and their stories, often preserving this knowledge even when others dismissed it. Bridger's marriages also reflected his connection to indigenous life. He took several Native American wives over the years, a common practice among mountain men, but also a reflection of his integration into tribal society. One of his most well-known wives was from the Flathead tribe, and through these unions, he fathered children who were raised with a blend of white and native traditions. These familial bonds further anchored him in the tribal world and gave him a personal stake in the evolving relationships between native peoples and incoming settlers or military forces. His dual identity as both a white frontiersman and a trusted figure within native circles made Bridger a unique and often conflicted figure. He was trusted by tribes who knew him as Old Gabe, a name spoken with a mix of familiarity and reverence. At the same time, he also worked with the U.S. Army and federal explorers, sometimes guiding them through lands that would later be seized or disrupted. Bridger often found himself in the middle of growing tensions between the government's push for expansion and the native people's fight for survival. He walked a tightrope, trying to honor both worlds, even as he saw the balance tipping toward irreversible change. Despite the growing hostility and violence that marked the mid-19th century, Bridger continued to advocate for peaceful coexistence whenever possible. He warned military leaders when their actions might provoke conflict, and he cautioned settlers not to underestimate the power and pride of the native nations. His voice often served as a bridge between worlds, one shaped by dialogue, not domination. And though he couldn't stop the tide of colonization, he used his influence to at least soften its impact where he could, offering wisdom drawn from a life lived in close proximity to those who had called the land home for generations. Jim Bridger's legacy is a multifaceted one, woven into the fabric of the American West and shaped by his extraordinary contributions to its exploration, its cultural history, and its myths. While Bridger is remembered as one of the most skilled and knowledgeable mountain men of the frontier, his influence extends far beyond the trails he blazed, the forts he established, or the relationships he built with native tribes. His legacy is one of survival, resilience, and adaptability, but also of bridging worlds, those of Native Americans, American settlers, and the ever-changing landscape of the West. One of the core elements of Bridger's legacy is his role in the exploration and mapping of the American West. Long before the age of railroads and telegraphs, when the United States was still grappling with the vast, uncharted lands to the west of the Mississippi River, Bridger served as an irreplaceable guide. His uncanny knowledge of the land, its waterways, and its passes made him an invaluable asset to explorers, military expeditions, and settlers alike. He was instrumental in opening up critical pathways for those seeking fortune and a new life in the West, guiding them safely through otherwise treacherous terrain. His intimate understanding of the land's topography shaped not only the routes taken by immigrants, but also the ways in which the United States expanded its boundaries. Bridger's founding of Fort Bridger in 1843 stands as a testament to his foresight and entrepreneurial spirit. The fort became a critical waypoint for travelers on the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails, as well as a trading post and military outpost during the increasingly volatile years of westward expansion. The establishment of the fort not only ensured Bridger's lasting influence on the region, but also marked the beginning of a shift in the American frontier, from one defined by individual fur trappers to one shaped by large-scale migrations, military presence, and settlement. His role in this pivotal moment in history helped solidify his place as a central figure in the narrative of the American West. Beyond his physical contributions, Bridger's legacy also lies in his relationships with Native Americans. He was one of the few frontiersmen who genuinely understood and respected the indigenous peoples of the West. His deep integration into native cultures, his knowledge of their languages, and his role as a trusted mediator between native tribes and the U.S. government make him an important figure in the history of Native American-European relations. While others may have viewed Native Americans as obstacles to progress, Bridger often worked to protect their interests, facilitating communication between tribes and military leaders or settlers when tensions ran high. His ability to navigate these cultural divides made him a symbol of the possibility for cooperation, even in an era defined by conflict. Bridger's legacy is also intertwined with his role in the fur trade. Though the trade itself declined as settlers and railroads advanced across the continent, Bridger's contributions during the fur trapping era helped shape the economic foundations of the American West. He was a central figure in the Rocky Mountain Fur Company and a key player in establishing trading posts and routes that would later serve as highways for settlers. His success in the fur trade was built on his resourcefulness, his skill as a trapper, and his ability to adapt to the changing economic landscape of the West. Even as the fur trade faded, his transition from trapper to guide, military advisor, and mediator was a natural evolution of his skills. As the American West was reshaped by the arrival of settlers, the construction of railroads, and the policies of the U.S. government, Bridger's legacy as a frontier icon continued to grow. He became the subject of legends and stories, many of which were exaggerated or romanticized by those who followed in his footsteps. Tales of his bravery, cunning, and near-miraculous survival became the stuff of folklore. In a sense, Bridger himself became a symbol of the frontier spirit, hardy, resilient, and untamed. His larger-than-life persona was one that captured the imagination of a nation that was both fascinated by and fearful of the wilderness. Jim Bridger's legacy is not just a product of his time, but a lasting influence on the American West. His life embodied the spirit of exploration, survival, and adaptation that defined the frontier. He was more than just a mountain man. He was a bridge between cultures, a witness to the transformation of an untamed land into a burgeoning nation, and a key player in the unfolding narrative of the American West. Though his name may not be as widely known today as those of other famous figures like Lewis and Clark, his contributions to the exploration and settlement of the West were immeasurable. His fort, his trails, his guidance, and his diplomacy helped shape the future of the United States. And his relationships with Native American tribes stand as a reminder of the complexities and challenges of a rapidly changing world. In the end, Jim Bridger's legacy is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit, the value of knowledge passed down through generations, and the power of connection across cultures. He may have walked the wilds of the American frontier, but his story transcends the mountains and rivers he navigated. It lives on in the history he helped to write, in the lands he mapped, and in the myths he inspired.